Welcome to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. Christopher Seepe has written two valuable books on the subject of landlording. He's the Landlords Association of Durham president. He's a course instructor, broker of record at Aztec Realty in Toronto, and he specializes in income generating and multi-residential investment properties. That's quite the portfolio. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you.
Chris, nice to have you on here. This is a hot topic, obviously, certainly all across the province, if not across the country, if not across the world. If you will, the disconnect or the inequity, if you will, between those who can afford and those who cannot afford to either own a home or put a roof over their head in terms of rental property. So we're really thrilled to have you on the show, and we'd like to really just get into it as dry and as bare bones as we need to get into to address the reality, not the sugar-coated stuff that we often hear about in the press. So I'll open the door to you there. We're at a deficit. Maybe 30 years ago, we had a balance of supply and demand, and now we're in a massive deficit. What do you see as the reality today?
Well, I thought when you were going to talk about the problem across the world, and you're talking about the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, I thought you were actually going to say between the government meddling and the private sector trying to get the job done. So maybe we can solve both agendas.
Let's do our best in 30 minutes here. Let's go for it.
Yeah. So everything changed between 1972 and 1975 here in Canada. In 1972, we had built about 40,000 purpose-built rental housing units in 1 year, 40,000. That dropped down to less than about 4,000 by 1975. And what happened in that period was rent control, essentially. But I don't want to get into rent control because that is a topic that will take us nowhere. So, but I wanted to answer your question. What happened? I think rent control and the ever-increasing involvement of government in the housing sector. If you go back and look at the House of Commons, which I have, look at the Ontario Legislature discussions on housing, I would argue 85% of all of their topics are the exact same things we're talking about today.
Yeah, not much has changed. And I mean, it's always been my thinking that supply and demand in the market, a free market, will find its place and things will be kept in check so long as demand is there. But demand far surpasses supply these days and has for increasingly for many years. Do you see a point with the way things are now where supply will catch up to demand in the rental housing market? Or if not, what do you think has to happen in order for it to catch up?
Well, you can't answer that question in half an hour, but I'm going to try and just, instead of giving you the play-by-play of how I came to the conclusion, I'll just tell you what the conclusion is. And if we have time, you can tear it apart. The issue of supply and demand really is the crux of the matter. And when I look at all of the programs that have come, all the legislation that's been passed, all the rhetoric that comes from politicians, most of their solutions and all of the solutions, I would say almost all of the solutions that the three parties came up with during the federal election with respect to availability and obtainability of housing were all focused on demand. They did not focus on supply. And I'll give you two examples. The first is they, for the last few years, have had the mortgage stress test.
Yeah.
And that's been controversial. It did seem to have some impact for a little while on reducing or stabilizing pricing, let's say, not reducing. But by doing that, what they did was lock out over 200,000 Canadian families from housing, from being able to purchase a house because they weren't qualified. Well, where were they before they went to look for buying a house? They were in rental properties.
That keeps them in the rental and stops the rotation.
That's right. So there's blockage at the top of the rental market, if you will. So all the people that are coming in at the bottom, the students, people who need affordable housing who are outside of the social programs and so on, they've been stopped. Conversely, if you take everybody is raging about, we need incentives for first-time buyers. And yeah, that's a fantastic thing to have, but by increasing the incentives for first-time buyers, you've increased more demand. So you got a much wider audience now of people who are looking for housing than you ever had before, but you didn't solve the problem of providing the housing. So giving them an incentive only means you've increased the competition, which means that they're all going to be vying in a auction style environment to drive up pricing.
Mm-hmm. You know what, Mike? This could be a one segment show, and I would die a happy man, because I love the fact that you were really, as a third party and an outsider from our show, if you will, thrilled to have you on here validating a number of the points that we've talked about. And then when you look over the past several years, and I'm not going to put a partisan stripe on any of the federal or provincial parties who've attempted various forms of legislation and what I would refer to as artificial manipulation. They have all focused, exactly as you said, on trying to either artificially incentivize or artificially restrict, but they don't actually address the problem that is really right in front of our face. So keep it up. We got a minute to go here before we got to go to break.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, if you look at the definition of affordable housing in Canada, and I've looked all over the world, I found one really good definition that actually resonates with me out of an organization called EuroCity. But if you look across Canada, all those definitions, whether municipal or federal level or provincial, they all talk about effectively an income to price ratio. Yeah. Right? This is what their income is. This is what the price is, either of a rental or of a house. And it should be lower, by a percentage, typically 25 or 30%, or shouldn't be more than 30% of your income. Well, that takes out of the question all of the other influences that drive pricing. Yeah. And I've got a list.
Well, Mike, we do have to go to break, and I'd love to unpack that a little bit more, because that is a great conversation. So, Mike, I'm going to let you start us off when we come back from the break, but stay with us for more with Chris Seepe on Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and Chris Seepe is our guest. And Chris is a landlord. He teaches on the subject of landlording. He's written a couple of books on the subject. Chris knows the rental housing industry in Ontario. And just before the break, you had pointed out that I think it's CMHC has defined affordable as being no more than 25% of one's income going towards their rent, which is well and good. But there's another statistic floating around out there recently, which shows that housing in Ontario has literally increased 50% in value on average in the past 2 years. So that proposition of 25%, is it something that the private sector can even achieve if they wanted to go forward and build rental properties within the affordability range? Can the numbers work?
Well, the formula is based on an income to price ratio that compares the income of the tenant to the rental cost of an apartment unit, and the two have nothing in common. I have no control as a landlord over how much money a tenant makes, so I can never define or help achieve the issue or achieve the ratio that they're looking for of 25%. So if I take a two-bedroom apartment at $1,500 a month, a tenant is going to have to make 4 times that, right, by their formula. So 1,500 times 4 is 6,000 a month, times 12 is 100,000 a year, 96,000 a year. So by their definition, the only person I could ever rent to, and my property is in a working class market, 2 bedrooms, $1,500. That's the going rate.
That's reasonable in our market.
Yeah.
For 2 bedrooms.
And I'm talking about 905 area code rents, not 416, which are even higher. right?
Mm.
So I don't see how it's achievable. There are so many other influences involved. The building insurance, I wrote a separate article about a month ago. It's an expose where the building insurance industry in Canada has actually had one of the best years in its recent history. And the rates went up between 2 and 3 times. The electricity has gone up over 50% in the last year alone. I can go on and on. Property taxes on average are going up about 3%.
Well, listen, let's get into this, Chris. I mean, when you have a prescribed rate by the province that says, 1.2% in any one particular year is the maximum that you're able to raise it. And when gas prices, natural gas prices, electricity prices, they all skyrocket, you're upside down. The reality is it's not just your opinion, Chris. It is the development community and the investor community's opinion, and which is why we've seen over the past 30 years, the number of purpose-built rentals plummet. It's literally less than 25.
There's no business case.
Yeah.
There's no business case to build it. And the government has coined a phrase called missing middle. Have you come up with that phrase? Have you heard that before?
Yeah.
The missing middle?
Yes.
So we're talking about anything from a 6-plex to a 30-unit property, basically. No one is building them because you can't justify it. Everybody is building condos. And the number one reason that developers are building condos is because they can get the money back in 5 years. If you build a rental property, it may take 20 years to get your money back, if ever.
So now the other thing that we can look at, though, the phenomenon is that as the housing prices have increased, and Mike referenced about 50% in the last couple of years, aggregate, if you will, it's also tougher to afford a home. And as you mentioned before the break, we're talking about stress tests, and the government instituted the stress test, which is designed to, in their eyes, make sure that you don't just get the keys to the house, but you make sure that you can keep the house in case the rates do change. The reality is that people can't get in and can't qualify unless they're finding some secondary income to subsidize. Incomes haven't kept pace with the house appreciation. So a lot of prospective buyers are considering second suites or rental accommodations in order to qualify on their mortgage application. What do we see? That's not purpose-built rentals, but that is one angle at which many people are finding a roof over their head, is living in not shared accommodation, but in an apartment in somebody's house.
Yes, that's a double-edged sword, unfortunately. That was one of the major strategies of the provincial government 4 and 5 years ago. They called them second suites, if you will. And it's backfired because the provincial legislation is so brutal. It's the Residential Tenancies Act in particular, combined with the catastrophic failure of the Landlord and Tenant Board, that's now taking upwards of 9 to 12 months to do evictions, and upwards of 2 years to do above guideline increases. There are legitimate investments that landlords have made to improve the properties, and the government is saying, well, we're not going to give you that money back.
Yeah. So basically,
so just to finish my thought, a lot of people who started second suites are taking them back because they don't want to be exposed to that legal and financial risk.
So basically, the potential is there. I think I said in one of our last shows that there is enough existing, already built residential real estate, at least within the city of Barrie, to accommodate everybody if you factor in the potential of second suites. And as Arif pointed out, more and more people, that is their only option to get in at that bottom rung of the real estate ownership ladder, is to buy that house that either has an existing second suite or the potential to build one in. But
yeah, Mike,
again, as you point out, it's just there's a lot of dissuasion to doing so with all the government legislation, and they keep trying to pour on more and more legislation, as we've seen recently in our own town here, that just only pushes people away from wanting to do it. So,
yeah, I would take that a step forward, or add to that and say that there is rental housing that's available today, and it could be affordable, or at least available to the, let's call them the vulnerable groups. I've had this conversation, I swear, at least 15 times with different agencies, both government and social housing. And their goals are totally misaligned with those of landlords. And until you align those goals between the two agencies, you will never, ever convince landlords to take on the vulnerable groups. They're not just vulnerable to the people who don't have the money, to the tenants themselves who are defined as a demographic group, but they're also vulnerable to the landlords who can suffer serious consequences leading ultimately to bankruptcy or loss of their properties.
So we got to go to break in just a second, but I want to use that as an opportunity to sort of introduce what we'll get into in the third segment here, the final segment, which is really some of those hard and set costs around the ownership and how the equation has to work or how the equation doesn't currently work. But what I'm hearing, and what I'm hearing more and more, is that all of the efforts put forward by either interest groups, advocacy groups, or government groups, et cetera, everything that we're seeing is creating more and more division. The reality is there is a segment of society that is vulnerable. There is a segment of society, and it's a growing segment, that simply cannot afford. Yet instead of actually addressing the challenge and creating a relatively achievable solution, or certainly progress, we're actually being pitted against each other. These groups are being pit against each other, and it really is an us versus them type of a scenario, and that's truly unhealthy. Let's get in the third segment, though, to looking at what those costs are and how we could propose a solution. Stay with us for more of Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're joined by Chris Seepe, and we're having a very plain English conversation around the topic of housing affordability, why we're at a disconnect. And certainly going into the last break, we started to talk about the fact that there are groups, advocacy groups and special interest groups who are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, which is arguing for those who maybe don't have quite the voice that they deserve, the people who are vulnerable on a fringe of society. And on the other side of the equation is the reality, the way things are. Is it sustainable? Is it viable to be a landlord today? And we're basically suggesting, Chris, that no, the answer is no. And there are solutions. Let's get into what are some of these realistic costs that a landlord or an investor might face just to break even, not to be a greedy landlord, as some people, are coining in society today. What is the reality and what can be done about it?
Well, you touched on a key word that I never hear anybody ever talk about when they talk about definition of affordability, and that is sustainability. All of these different definitions are not sustainable, and that would be a long conversation, and you have to look at the arithmetic and the business models and so on to demonstrate that. But let me address your question more directly and just talk about other influences that I see that are affecting affordability and why it cannot be addressed by any one group or any one tier of government. So you've got construction costs, which you've talked about before, but the price of land has gone through the roof. Financing costs, especially interest rates, they're fine today, but 5 years from now, if you went from 1%, or let's say it's a 2% market today, and you go to 4%, that may not seem like a lot, but you've basically doubled your interest payments. Right. So if I'm paying $12,000 a month to finance my property today, I've got to pay $24,000 a month because interest went up. Nothing else changed, including the income stream. You've also got the indebtedness of buyers and renters. Their indebtedness is an all-time high. It's never been this high in Canadian history. You've got inflation, which is around the corner. I think we're going to see a double-barreled shotgun of hyperinflation and recession within the next 4 years. And if that happens, woe betide the vulnerable groups, especially seniors who are on fixed incomes. We've got the issues of housing quality, the size of these properties. You can call them collectively spatial concerns. Do you get 3 bedrooms or 2 bedrooms? How many can I build? Densification, if you will, of a property. taxation is a huge issue with us. As a landlord, we have to pay 50% tax because we're considered passive operators. Passive. I guarantee to you, even after a decade, I'm still working 6 to 7 hours a day, 7 days a week on what I do. The taxes, LTT, land transfer tax, property tax, development charges, building permits, recoverable capital cost allowance, capital gains, all of these things have a huge impact on all forms of housing. And no one's talking about that stuff because that impacts government income. And that's the last thing they want to be talking about here. Municipal planning and zoning has been talked about till we're blue in the face. It takes, 3 months to build a house and 5 years to get the planning done.
Yeah.
Property, yeah.
And the big catch-22 is as it becomes increasingly less attractive and more difficult to produce the product we need to accommodate the renters, it just makes the renting that much more in demand and that much more unaffordable.
Well, developers
I looked at
Sorry, I was just going to say developers are always going to build. But what you've seen is a massive increase in the number of industrial properties, retail properties, and office product before COVID.
Or a sublet market in the residential.
Well, and
so we got a variety of factors coming into play here, though. We do have immigration, and we want as a country to have immigration. We've got those who do not qualify for the stress test who are staying in rental accommodation, putting further backward pressure on that accommodation. We've got prohibitive development charges, and yes, they are real costs to a municipality, but the development charges are a challenge to get a developer to put a shovel in the ground, and the amount of time that it takes to get it in the ground. There are so many different influences in there. Add to that the fact that we are currently at a 4.5% inflation rate, as the last check I heard last week. And yes, you said the highest debt we've ever had, and the cost of goods, supply chain issues that we're having have put building materials through the roof. None of this, if you were to do the math, take away 50% of all the things that we've just talked about, it's still prohibitive. What are we going to do to make supply happen? What is the answer to make supply happen?
Well, that's the age-old question. I think one of the things you have to do is encourage people to want to build. I mean, that's a simple, tongue-in-cheek answer. That doesn't really address the process. Maybe that you could call that a mission statement. But if there was one thing that I think the government could do is stop funding social housing. And of course, as soon as people hear that, they're going to go ballistic. But let me finish what I said and don't take it out of context. Stop funding municipal housing, social housing, and instead channel that money into infrastructure. If you build the transit, if you build the police station and the fire departments, lay down the roads, put in the sewers, I guarantee to you, I absolutely guarantee I would bring you 50 developers myself. They will line up around the block and start building. It doesn't have to be downtown. It doesn't have, you could build a whole new suburb and put in all of the amenities that people want in downtown Toronto. You could put them in Upper Scarborough or whatever, right? And develop those limits.
Yeah, and another demographic that Arif could have included on that list he just gave is seniors, an aging seniors population. Many of them are retiring into that rental market, and many of them as well are looking at shared accommodations or just different living standard, aging in place or aging in place with assisted living in their home, maybe other seniors keeping an eye.
In terms of seniors, they're fatally flawed as a rental group. If you take someone who moved in today at say $1,000 a month, and then 10 years from now, their rent has gone up to $1,200 a month, but the market's gone up to $1,500 a month. That $300 may not seem like very much, but when you extrapolate that, that $300 a month becomes $3,600 a year. Now we have a saying that $1 of NOI or net operating income is $20 of joy. So if I take that $3,600 times 20, that represents $72,000 of lost equity per senior in my building forever until they move out.
Chris, and therein lies the tragedy, and maybe only part of the challenge. But what I'm hearing from you in summary is if government at all levels just stuck to what they were supposed to do, we would be able to allow the private sector, the market, to figure itself out. We've got to go. I want to thank you for being our guest on Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. We'll see you again next time.